What's a disturbing historical fact that not many people know? The Taiping Rebellion seems to still be somewhat obscure, which is curious as it is one of the wildest and deadliest conflicts in human history. For context, this was a rebellion against the Manchu-dominated Qing dynasty that took place from 1850 to 64. With a death toll ranging from 20 to 30 million, it stood as possibly one of the deadliest conflicts prior to WWI and World War II. The death toll is not the most interesting part of this conflict, however. For the leader of the rebellion, Wanhong Shuquan, claimed to be the brother of Jesus Christ and wanted to overthrow the ruling Qing and institute a theocracy where he would convert the population of China to his own unique syncretic form of Christianity. It is a truly wild story with disturbing results. Circa 74,000 years ago, there was a supervolcano that erupted in Indonesia called the Toba. Following the event and the climate and environmental changes that followed, humans were on the brink of extinction. It's estimated there were less than 10,000 humans in the whole world. What's crazy is that's just one of multiple near-extinction events our species has lived through. Unit 731 was a Japanese bioweapons research facility. This SHIT was straight out of Stephen King. Removing fetuses from pregnant women while they were awake. Exchanging limbs casually while the patient was awake. Exposing patients to such a high degree of pressure that they would basically implode. Tearing off frostbitten flesh while the patient was aware. Forced rape to test the effects of STIs. There's a lot more, and these motherfuckers had an entire room of their facility where someone's full-time job was to chop up and incinerate bodies.
Some more fun. Test subjects were often referred to as logs, as in pieces of wood. Other common euphemisms were non-human primates, long-tailed monkeys, and Manchurian monkeys. Other experiments included subjecting subjects to lethal doses on X-rays, testing various weapons including flamethrowers. Some were exposed to the bubonic plague, and at least one was put in a centrifuge.
Subjects were electrocuted, starved, put in low-pressure chambers, frozen, and in one case I remember a man was sawed in half and pickled. Women were raped so a steady stream of infants were available for testing. At least one of these infants was frozen to death simply to see how long it took. Apparently vivisection while the victim was alive and fully conscious was a standard favorite. Researching what those people did will make you question everything about humanity. And of course, most got off with barely a slap on the wrist.
The guy that pioneered the thing, General Shi, was let off by the Americans because they thought that the US government could benefit from the data collected at the laboratory. Some decades later, he stood in front of some of his comrades and proclaimed pride in his work. As he was serving the Japanese Empire, this mother chucker had all the time to consider his actions. No come to Jesus moment, no insight, no moment of regret, no empathy, just an abiding and callous appreciation for one's conscientious devotion to nation. To him, this was nothing more than a duty and maybe even a bout of entertainment. If he were honest to himself, he enjoyed this. As did many of his comrades. They became accustomed to these operations and grew to enjoy it. They took pleasure in something like this. It is truly a concrete evidence that there is nothing in the human spirit which is worth upholding as an ongoing sense of moral triumph. There is just casual activity holding each person back from becoming an unfettered monster.
On top of most of the leaders not getting punished, we also learned essentially nothing from the research. Nearly all their notes were pointless. We got descriptions of what a lot of horrible conditions look like once they go further than they should ever be allowed to, but that's pretty much it. No true science, just suffering.
Chinese Empress Wu Zetian is said to have once punished her rival by cutting off her arms and legs and throwing her in a large vat of wine to drown. The Romanov daughters didn't die right away. They had to be finished off with bayonets.
That was actually most of the Romanovs. When they were taken to the basement to be shot, it was basically a bunch of amateurs with crappy weapons doing the shooting. After the first few shots, there was so much smoke they couldn't see what they were shooting at and basically were deaf. Just a really inefficient and cruel execution all around.
Also, several of the corsets were stuffed with jewels and other heirlooms, which led initial bullets to bounce off them. Totally awful to think about.
Andrew Jackson collected scalps and noses. Andrew Jackson hated Native Americans like Jason Voorhees hates horny teenagers. Not content with just killing them, he then insisted on mutilating their bodies in horrific ways. The guy on your $20 bill once boasted, "I have on all occasions preserved the scalps of my killed," which isn't the most inspirational quote we've heard from a president. When Jackson's defenders talk about how good he was for adopting a Native American baby whose entire family died, they usually fail to mention why they were dead in the first place. Jackson, who had no qualms about targeting peaceful encampments, had his men systematically murder hundreds of Creek Indian men, women, children, and even infants, and then cut off their noses to keep track of exactly how many they killed. According to one account, the soldiers ended up with a pile of 557 noses. That really sounds like something we should be saying about Attila the Hun, not the 7th U.S. president. Archaeologists up to now failed to find the bodies of all the people who died on the Waterloo battlefield in 1815. Last year, some historians published a report telling why. Apparently, the industrialization of sugar production made of sugar beets really started off in the 1830s with a peak production in Belgium. And because people wanted their sugar to be white, the stuff had to be filtered before it could be sold. During that time, the filters would be stuffed with bone meal, and because of the industrialization, a lot of that was needed, and the historians could prove that there were permissions issued for digging up animal bones from the battlefield. But if you check numbers and the estimations of the bone meal needed for the filters and the money that came together, it is most likely that the sugar for England's tea was filtered through the bones of the fallen persons. In 1947, approximately 7,000 metric tons of munitions stored in underground bunkers exploded and destroyed the village of Mythols, Switzerland. It was the largest non-nuclear explosion up to that date. A safety study in 2018 determined that there are still approximately 7,000 metric tons of unexploded munitions buried in the rubble of the first explosion under the century-built village of Mythols. The Swiss federal authorities have ordered the village evacuated by 2030 and then intend on a 10-year cleanup campaign. George Washington's false teeth weren't made of wood. Some of them were real teeth that he bought from his slaves. Also, when he was dying, his doctors kept bloodletting him, and in the end they drained about 40% of his blood, which probably didn't help. This fact certainly pales in comparison to the genocides, but single women in some states were legally unable to acquire birth control in the United States until 1972 with the Eisenstadt versus Baird decision. For those of you too young to remember 1972, remember that things that you take for granted can be taken away. Vote appropriately. The business plot of 1933. The wealthiest businessmen of America, like the names you see on banks and buildings in America today, allegedly formed a plot to overthrow President FDR and install a military leader in his place. Their choice was a U.S. Marine general named Smedley Butler, as he was a decorated leader of the highest rank. Butler, a loyal patriot, played along until they were seriously about to attempt to collapse the U.S. economy by holding the financial stability of the country hostage. He rolled on them and testified to Congress about the planned coup. No one was prosecuted. General Smedley Butler may be the reason the world does not officially have a society like the United Corporations of Rockefeller, Morgan, and Chase. Source: had an activist U.S. Gov professor. That the number of people who died in the Holocaust, the often cited 6 million, is sort of a historically negotiated, agreed-upon number. But some historians have had different figures, the highest being 4 times that. I took a media studies course on the Holocaust, basically how it's represented in film, TV, literature, and art, so by extension, its history as well, though that wasn't the focus.
This is only the Jewish part. I was under the impression total Holocaust deaths was 11 to 12 million, including LGBT, disabled, political prisoners, Roma, etc.
The number is largely based on the censuses of the countries from before the Holocaust and then comparing it to how many survived. While it does mean there have been people who it turns out were counted twice, which is fuel for Holocaust deniers, one of the things people just don't really get about Jews in Europe was that there were many cities with hundreds of thousands of Jews, of which maybe a few thousand survived. Budapest alone had something around 150,000 Jews, but even then, 6 million is the number of Jewish victims, while Jews by far were the most targeted group. The estimates I've heard was that when all the group's totals are combined, Jews, Romani, LGBTQ individuals, political opponents of the Nazis, etc., the number is around 13 million.
When the Allies liberated the concentration camps towards the end of World War II, the people imprisoned there were freed, except for the gay men, who were sent back to regular prisons to serve out the rest of their sentences. As part of Project MKUltra in the 20th century, the US government performed deeply unethical life-altering experiments on uninformed US and Canadian citizens. The experiments did result in death some of the time. People know slavery existed in the New World and the Civil War ended it, but people really don't want to know the details. One of the most disturbing aspects is that slaves were used for investment purposes, collateral for loans, and for leased labor. People think of some rich guy owning slaves on a plantation to keep him rich. What people don't realize is that many of those rich guys were heavily indebted, and the slaves on the plantation were used as collateral for loans so they could afford their over-the-top lifestyles. Slaves would also be rented out to other farms, to factories, and even stores. This is all compounded by the fact that slave owners owned the right to the children of slaves and would often break up families for business reasons. The use of slaves as investment vehicles and collateral for loans is commonly glossed over, but is an important factor in why influential people in the South were fighting abolition so hard. It wasn't just that these people might have had to pay people for farm work, it's that they would likely lose their homes and other property in the process. Genghis Khan's empire obliterated to cities from two different empires at their peak, Merv and Baghdad. At Merv, when his horde plundered the city, Genghis Khan sat on his golden throne and watched the city burning, ordering his soldiers to kill every living thing in the city. Historians call it a very successful genocide. His grandson invaded Baghdad and razed it to the ground at the peak of its scientific progress, destroyed what was perhaps the largest library at the time. During the Great Emu War in Australia, the government lost a war against emus. Imagine trying to control birds with military force and failing. It's both disturbing and bizarre. People used to eat mummies. They thought they had medicinal properties. The single greatest naval disaster in history by number of lives lost was the sinking of the Gustloff in January 1945. It was a German military transport ship evacuating civilians and military personnel from the Kurland Pocket. It was a former cruise ship with the Kraft Duurk Freud fleet, overloaded with over 10,000 passengers and crew. Since some of the passengers were German military, it did not qualify as a hospital ship under international accords. The Soviet sub S-13 torpedoed the Gustloff, sinking it with over 9,000 casualties. A German serial killer Grobman made hot dogs from human flesh.
Worst comment yet.
While extremely safe in terms of failure-success ratio, space travel can be truly terrifying. Vladimir Koromov's heat shielding failed, something known to the Soviet government, who were advised against launch by scientists and fellow cosmonauts. His last words were that heat was rising in the capsule, but it can also be vaguely made out that he is cursing the Soviet government. They recovered his remains. I'd advise against looking it up, but there's no gore. Utterly unrecognizable. The crew of Apollo 1 tried to open the door during the infamous oxygen fire and probably would have survived if only the capsule could be opened from the inside. It's now a universal safety feature. The crew of the Challenger was alive and well after the explosion and running through emergency protocols, but they were falling too fast to make a difference. On a lighter note, Gus Grissom nearly killed the Gemini crew after he brought a sandwich to space and clogged the instrumentation with crumbs. NASA was not amused. Something about the chainsaw being originally invented to cut the pubic bone of women open in labor if the child could not fit through the birth canal, lol. One disturbing historical fact that not many people know is about the radium girls. In the early 20th century, young women working in watch factories were exposed to radium, a radioactive substance used to paint watch dials. They were instructed to lick their paintbrushes to create a fine point, ingesting small amounts of radium each time. The companies assured them that radium was harmless. Over time, these women developed serious health issues, including jaw necrosis dubbed radium jaw, anemia, and bone fractures. Many died as a result of radium poisoning. The legal battles fought by the surviving radium girls led to improved workplace safety standards and contributed to the establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration (OSHA) in the United States. The state of South Carolina executed a 14-year-old child in 1944. The child, George Stinney Jr., was executed for the murder of Betty June Binniger and Mary Emma Thames. His conviction was vacated in 2014 because a judge found that Stinney did not receive a fair trial, even by 1940s standards. During the Victorian era, people would often take photos with their deceased loved ones, propping them up to look alive for one final family portrait. Leprosy colonies of Hawaii. People who were diagnosed with leprosy were forcibly banished to Kalaupapa to live out the rest of their lives. They were dug graves, had to stand in them, while their families and friends basically had a living funeral for them where they had the dirt thrown on them. They were then pronounced dead to the world and no longer part of the community. This continued through 1969, even after Hawaii officially became a state. Churchill was responsible for famine in West Bengal. I promise you they were humans and their lives were just as important as others. The Paraguayan War was absolutely brutal. Estimates vary, but at least half the male fighting age population of Paraguay died, and there are even estimates that 90% of the male population died. Both during and after W2, American conservatives defended the actions of the Nazis, often portraying Nazis as the real victims of the war. Oregon's Trail of Tears and the businesses the government took away from the tribes of southern Oregon. U.S. military's Ordnance Unit in Vietnam intentionally sabotaged the military's rifles out of spite for the standard rifle contract being taken from Springfield Armory, who they were chummy with, and given to Armalite. This includes making modification to change performance for the worse, changing ammo used to ammo that doesn't work well with it, refusing to provide cleaning kits, insisting guns self-clean, etc. With the disclaimer that this is as presented in the Talmud, which was written by people who were ideologically and politically opposed to Herod the Great. Over the course of Herod the Great's life, he assassinated all of the Hasmoneans who ruled the kingdom of Judea, except one princess he intended to marry in order to give his reign legitimacy. The Hasmonean princess committed suicide after her entire family was murdered, but in order to ensure that Herod's legitimacy as the legal ruler of Judea persisted, he had her body preserved in honey. In 1985, the police in Philadelphia dropped 2 bombs from a helicopter on the house where members of a Black Power group lived. They killed 11 people, including children. The bombs started a fire that destroyed the whole neighborhood. So many people have suffered so that you as an individual could be here. Countless generations of life were the product of so many living beings' will to survive. It's mind-boggling to think we're here by chance. Imagine if one of our ancestors made a bad decision that cost them their lives, we wouldn't be here.